Hey everyone, what's going on? Thanks for tuning in to Relevant Jukebox, and today we're going to talk about the latest album from JPEGMAFIA, LP. So this is the fourth full-length studio album from the rapper and producer JPEGMAFIA, and it is one that I've been pretty hotly anticipating ever since he started dropping singles and a variety of EPs over the past year or so. Now, Peggy's music overall can easily be described as experimental hip-hop, but it still feels like something different overall, and he really feels pretty far displaced from some of his contemporaries. Avant-garde and eclectic are two other words that come to mind when I'm trying to wrap my head around his production style, and somehow he's found a way to tweak things and sound even more left field over here on LP, as I think some of the tracks that land on this project are his boldest to date. Now, it's also important to note that there are two versions of this album floating around out there. There is the online version, which is officially released and is on major streaming services, but then you also have the offline version, which shows up on his Bandcamp and on YouTube. There are some differences in the flow and order of the tracks between each release, but also the offline version has some cuts that show up that don't come on the online version, and to my understanding that has to do with some issues clearing some of the samples. But for this review, I'm gonna kind of go over a combination of the two versions. Now, no matter what version you decide to seek out, this album over here does feel a little bit similar in sound to his last release, All My Heroes Are Cornballs. Specifically, the songwriting approach of these tracks and how they don't feel like they fit into any other blueprint in hip-hop and have their own flow and structure going on. It's also pretty dense and layered with tons of samples that come from who knows where. However, there were a few tracks on here that actually didn't work for me. One being Nemo, which I just think is pretty repetitive sounding overall. Also, the beat is kind of standard for JPEGMAFIA. Nice is another track that shows up later in the track list that is basically just an interlude, but it doesn't really add much to the overall listening experience. And on the online version, this track is followed by BMT, which is another one on here that I feels like suffers from being too repetitive. Also, the beat on that track is so blown out to the point where it doesn't really sound good. And also on the online version, he closes the whole project out with the Bald remix, which I wasn't really a huge fan of, mainly because it follows Bald, but it also just isn't as good as the original version in my opinion. Now, outside of those few tracks, there are some of my favorite JPEGMAFIA tracks to date on this project, one of which being End Credits, which is probably one of the most wild sounding hip-hop tracks I've heard in a long time. It sounds like Peggy's rapping over a progressive metal track that's playing on MTV at like 2 in the morning or something, and that track is actually the newest Animals as Leaders single, Monomyth. I do kind of wish this was the last track of the album, as I feel like it would have been a little bit more fitting, but Rebound was another huge highlight on here for me. The beat is just absolutely fantastic with those really lazy horns that he layers in and all that bass. Also, Dat Piff Mafia shows up with a feature on this track and just absolutely kills it. I mean, his voice just sounds so perfect on this beat. OG is another track on here that is, yes, a little bit more on the briefer side, but also one of the cooler sounding ones on the project. The way that he mixed this track is pretty interesting. I mean, the sample that he chose is really quiet and buried, and there's a lot of like gigantic bass on this track too, but that also sort of comes off as quiet and understated, which is interesting. But after a couple passes of this track, it really clicked with me, and it has easily just one of the most cool, sinister sways to it that makes me feel like I'm invincible when I'm listening to it. I was also really stoked to see that TK Maizda shows up with a vocal feature on the track Ghost of Ranking Dread, which is another big highlight on here for me. Her vocal appearance is subtle, but effective overall, and like, more of these two together in the future, please. Now, all of these tracks that I just mentioned do show up on both versions, but if I'm being honest, I think I prefer the offline version just a little bit more. One reason being is that the track Hazard Duty Pay shows up on the offline version, and that's just like an all-time discography standout in my opinion. It has a really prominent sample in there from what sounds like some like 80s soul track or something like that, but I mean, that one didn't get cleared, I guess, but it's just such an incredible track. Also, Untitled, which shows up as the closer on the offline version, I think slaps as well and is a better closer than the Bald remix. But yeah, I mean, if you've been following Peggy up until this point and you've been a fan, I mean, I really don't think you're not gonna like this. The production on here is absolutely wild as usual. It's not as aggressive as Veteran or Black Ben Carson, but it is still aggressive overall, don't get me wrong. He just channels this aggression in like a different way that comes off a little bit more subtle, but I do prefer the way that he pulls that off on here. Also, there is far less singing by Peggy on this project as compared to like cornballs. Thought's Prayer is the only track on here that shows up where he's experimenting with that, but I mean, for the most part, he's just rapping his ass off on all these tracks. And I mean, he still finds a way to just kind of separate himself from everybody else and have a sound that's really hard to pin down, and he even takes that to like another level on here, I think. And you know, in the future, I really just hope that he continues to reach for these crazy new heights, because every time he goes for some really wild, out there idea, it always turns up to be the best tracks, I think. And with that being said, I'm feeling an 8.5 over here on LP. So for all you collectors out there, I have looked over at JPEG's website, and there are no physical releases of this just yet, but keep your eyes peeled, because Peggy likes to drop merch at random and at really late times in the night, and they're usually in small quantities. And if you have listened to this new JPEGMAFIA project already, let me know what you thought about it in the comment section down below. And as always, thank you so much for watching. Make sure to like and share, and if you want more content from me, hit that subscribe button. Peace.